By 1177, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was running out of time. Nearly 80 years after the First Crusade, Christians still held the Holy City and a string of fortresses along the Mediterranean coast, but their grip was no longer secure. These strongholds sat scattered across hostile country, hemmed in by Muslim-controlled territory to the north in Syria and to the south in Egypt. For decades, the Islamic world had been fractured by rivalry, which had given the Crusader states breathing room. That breathing room was disappearing fast. One man, Saladin, had spent years stitching Egypt and Syria into a single power, and Jerusalem no longer faced scattered raiding parties, it faced the full weight of a rising empire. Behind its walls and castles, the kingdom looked sturdier than it actually was. Its nobles squabbled over influence, its garrisons were spread thin across distant fortresses, and many of its best knights were stationed far from the capital. Sacred significance alone couldn't man the walls. Defending Jerusalem required soldiers, horses, grain, and men willing to die for it, and the kingdom was short on all four. Some nobles had already begun quietly arranging ships and exit plans, convinced the realm had only weeks left. Then word arrived that Saladin was massing an army aimed not at a border raid, but at Jerusalem itself. The throne belonged to Baldwin IV, crowned at 13 and only 16 when this story unfolds. He was no ordinary monarch. Leprosy was eating away at his body, his hands wrapped in bandages, his fingers too weak to grip a sword properly, his face hidden behind a silver mask. Many assumed he shouldn't even be alive, let alone leading a kingdom into war. Yet inside that failing frame was a sharp political and military mind, one that grasped exactly what losing Jerusalem would mean for the entire Christian presence in the Holy Land. Opposing him was Saladin, called the Sword of Islam, a sultan at the absolute peak of his power. He was warrior, statesman, and unifier all at once, having welded Egypt and Syria into a single force stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates, commanding both the wealth of one and the manpower of the other. To his followers, this campaign wasn't simply a war, it was a holy mission to reclaim the sacred city, and his name alone was fearsome enough that fortresses dreaded his arrival before a single arrow flew. His armies were accustomed to winning, and his commanders had begun to believe the age of the Crusader states was nearly over. Set against that, a sick teenager clinging to a shrinking kingdom looked like no contest at all. In the autumn of 1177, Saladin launched the largest campaign of his career, gathering roughly 26,000 mounted warriors, including his elite Mamluk cavalry, backed by a supply train stretching for miles with horses, camels, gold, and grain. This wasn't a raid, it was an invasion. Convinced Jerusalem was too weak and too divided to resist, and that a teenage king crippled by disease posed no real threat, Saladin bypassed the fortress of Ascalon rather than waste time besieging it, pushing straight toward the greater prize. His army advanced with swelling confidence, foraging parties fanned out, discipline loosened, and commanders assumed victory was simply a matter of time. Saladin had made one serious miscalculation. He expected Baldwin to hide behind Jerusalem's walls and wait out a siege. Baldwin did the opposite. On the morning of November 25th, he rode out not to flee but to attack, a decision that defied nearly every rule of military logic. His force amounted to roughly 500 knights, including some 80 Knights Templar, plus about 3,000 infantry, hopeless numbers next to Saladin's host. But Baldwin understood the math worked against him the longer he waited. If Saladin was allowed to regroup and settle into a siege, the kingdom's last opening would vanish. He had to hit while the enemy was still scattered and overconfident. So he ordered a forced march of roughly 45 miles in 36 hours, brutal even for healthy men. For Baldwin it was agony. When he couldn't walk, knights carried him, and when he couldn't sit upright, they strapped him to his saddle. This wasn't an army marching to defend a city. It was a desperate gamble to catch Saladin at his most exposed, and as the two forces converged near Montgisard, neither side yet grasped how completely the day was about to turn. When Baldwin's exhausted column finally spotted the enemy, scouts brought electrifying news. Saladin's army was strung out across miles of countryside, foraging parties scattered, units thin, discipline slack, with no expectation that the Leper King would dare appear in open ground. Some knights, staring at the sheer scale of the host before them, sank into despair. Baldwin had the true cross brought forward, dismounted, and knelt before it in prayer in full view of his men. Watching their suffering king beg for strength, many of the knights wept, and fear hardened into resolve. Lifted back onto his horse, bandaged hands and silver mask in plain sight, Baldwin reminded them that David had once faced Goliath through faith alone, and that today they would do the same, not with numbers, but with speed and conviction. Around 11 that morning, Saladin spotted distant dust clouds but dismissed them as a small scouting party, certain a 16-year-old Leper King would never dare leave Jerusalem's walls. That misplaced confidence cost him precious minutes. By midday, Crusader banners were unmistakable on the ridgeline, and the truth set in. Baldwin's full force was bearing down on him. Muslim units scrambled to regroup, but an army strung out across miles cannot snap into formation in moments, and Baldwin gave them no time to try. Around 2 in the afternoon he raised his bandaged hand, lances dropped, and 500 horsemen drove straight at the heart of Saladin's host. What looked from a distance like firm, open cavalry country concealed ravines and deep cuts in the earth, harmless to an army holding formation but lethal to one in panic. Baldwin had noticed them, Saladin had not. The Knights Templar spearheaded the charge, slamming into troops that hadn't finished forming, lances and hooves tearing through the front ranks before they could brace. Since the Muslim formation wasn't complete, the shock spread instead of absorbing, and within minutes, retreat in one sector triggered panic in the next. Then Baldwin's infantry surged out from concealment on the flank, and although too few to truly encircle the enemy, they created a deadly illusion. The cry spread that they were surrounded. It wasn't true, but in the chaos nobody stopped to check. What had been a battle became a rout. Fleeing warriors poured straight into the ravines Baldwin had counted on. Horses stumbling, men trampling each other, weapons discarded to run faster. Even Saladin's personal guard wavered and broke, and the Sultan himself abandoned his horse for a faster camel to escape the field, a sight that finished off whatever resistance remained. The Crusaders pursued for hours, hunting down scattered groups until the once mighty host of 26,000 had dissolved into men running for their lives. That evening, Montgisard was a field of corpses, broken weapons, and ravines turned into mass graves. Baldwin, helped down from his horse and nearly spent, led his surviving men in prayer, rather than celebration. Saladin's abandoned camp yielded horses, weapons, food, and silver, supplies that helped keep the fragile kingdom alive a little longer. News of the victories set Jerusalem's bells ringing, even as Baldwin's body kept failing him year by year. He reigned a few more years before leprosy finally killed him, and barely 2 years later, Jerusalem fell to Saladin after all. Montgisard never changed that long-term outcome, but it proved, if only for one afternoon, that 26,000 men could be broken by 500.